my series, How the Gospels Became History, based on my book by the same name. Subtitled Jesus and Mediterranean Myths, this study was published in 2019 by Yale University Press, and it is my continuation of Jesus Deus, and I encourage everybody to go check out that series, which is available free on YouTube. In the introduction, I introduce what I mean by myth and history in the ancient sense, and how the Gospels fit into a hybrid genre called Mythic historiography. Chapter 1 deals with Jesus' myth theory. Chapter 2 provides my theory of comparing myths. Chapter 3 then starts my mythic biography of Jesus. We start with the incarnation, genealogy in chapter 4, divine conception in chapter 5, dream visions and prophecies in chapter 6, the Magi and the star in chapter 7, the child in danger in chapter 8, the righteous lawgiver of chapter 9, miracles in chapter 10, the scapegoat or pharmakos in chapter 11, empty tombs and translations in 12, 13 deals with disappearance and recognition, 14 heavenly ascent, 15 literary eyewitnesses, and finally my conclusion on why it is that historicity is so important for religious believers in the West, that is, Christians in the West, who uphold historicity as the key to Christian truth. I hope everyone will take a look at this book, and as I go through it, consider purchasing the book and read it along with this series of online lessons. My Amazon author page is in the description. Go check that out. But without further ado, let's begin. Today we'll be looking at my introduction entitled The Gospels, Mythography, and Historiography. In this chapter, I introduce all the themes of the book, dealing with myth and history, and provide a roadmap for those interested in reading further. My overall thesis for the book is that the Gospel writers used historical tropes to convince readers that Gospel myths actually took place, and in this sense, were true. In Western culture, the historicization of certain events has a bearing on truth. What happened in the past is often taken to be a measure of whether it was true or not. If something didn't happen, it's false. If something did happen, it was true. So certainly Christians today, just as they were in the late 1st and early 2nd century, they were motivated to present their myths, or as I say, mythoi, as recording events that really happened in the past. And that was genuinely important to them. They didn't want their materials being read as 2 Peter says, cleverly devised myths. In the book, I don't talk about myths, but of mythos, or in the plural, mythoi. This is, of course, the Greek word from which the English word is derived, and the ancient Greek word has a different meaning than the English word. The common meaning of myth in modern English on the street is that a myth is something that seems to be true but is actually false, and that's how it's used mostly even in book titles. So what I wanted to do was to discard that and all the assumptions associated with the term myth, and go back to the term mythos. And the Greeks, or that is Greek educators, helpfully defined what a mythos was. A mythos was a story relating events that are generally considered to be fantastical or impossible. A mythos is not, by its very nature, untrue, even if it seems initially as unbelievable. Likewise, the ancients did not speak of history, but of historia, and historia can refer simply to inquiry, but it came to refer to a story that relates, or a story that is thought to relate, events that actually occurred in the past. So Herodotus, as the father of history, is the father of Historia, that is, the person who originated the genre in which we had a continuous series of connected tales that were thought to have actually happened in the past, rather than a continuous series of tales that involved elements that were too fantastical to believe. So there was history on the one side and mythography or logography on the other. Now, having set up this binary between mythos and historia, history and mythography, I want to emphasize that this binary was always fluid. There was never a strong and fast distinction between mythos and historia. The genres tended to blend, which is to say that historia included elements of mythos, and mythos included elements of historia, because, after all, the Greeks believed their myths, and they believed that the vast majority of them related events that occurred in the past. And this includes the expedition of Jason and the Argonauts. It includes the Trojan War. It includes the adventures and 12 labors of Heracles, and so many other great stories from the annals of mythology. These events really happened for the Greeks. So, 2 points here. First, ancient historians, though they aimed at truth, also included the miraculous, or miraculous tales, for readers' interest and engagement. They were not dry as dust, boring authors. They were fun and adventurous authors. And so Herodotus, when he tells stories, also includes stories which he did not himself believe and himself did not vouch for. In some cases, he did vouch for them, but modern scholars refuse to believe them. And Herodotus openly says, decide for yourself. The second point is that because the genres between mythography and historiography were fluid, gospel writers could take advantage of this situation, and they could historicize the miraculous tales of their teacher without transgressing the canons of historical writing. In other words, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not set out to write mythography. They set out to write historia in the ancient sense, but they included elements that others would take as myth. In so doing, however, they presented their myths in historiographical form, in historiographical framework, and with historiographical tropes to make them seem as believable and plausible as they could. So at the end of the book, I discuss the 10 historiographical tropes that gospel writers are documented to have used, and I'll just list them here in the introduction for the sake of ease of reference. First of all, one way to historicize something is to objectify it. That is, if you're telling about events that are inherently subjective, like dream visions, and you relate them in such a way that the person in the subjective vision is acting objectively in the outside world, that's objectification. And that's a way of describing things to highlight the reality effect of what was seen in the vision. In reality, no one else saw the vision, but you can describe the vision and narrate the vision in such a way that the person in the vision interacts as a normal human being in the real world of cause and effect. Another trope is synchrony, that is, calling upon the names of well-known rulers and statesmen and other political figures, and mentioning them as you mention your own hero, in this case, Jesus. So, for instance, Luke mentions Quirinius, the governor of Syria, even though he misdates him by about 10 years. It's significant that Quirinius is still mentioned, along with Caesar Augustus, etc. Syntype is similar. It's the mention of real historical places when you're speaking about your myths. So, Again, we mentioned real places like Galilee and Nazareth, Bethany, Bethlehem, and Jerusalem, even though the events in these real historical places may not have taken place. The third trope is matter-of-fact presentation. You can tell fantastical tales in a fantastical way, but you can also present them as matter-of-fact events that are juxtaposed by other matter-of-fact events, so that the fantastical is mixed in an airtight way with the humdrum and banal. A third technique is vividness. If you portray something with intensity and detail, readers are more likely to take it as something that really happened rather than as something that was invented out of your own head. Another technique is literary eyewitnesses, which is the creation of eyewitnesses who exist in the narrative but don't exist outside the narrative. That is, you tell a story about something, and then in the story itself, you say that there are eyewitnesses to the event that happened in the story, but there are in fact no eyewitnesses outside of your own head. Another technique is staged skepticism, where again, you present characters within the story as disbelieving the events in the story and then being proved wrong. Again, this has no relation to what's going on in the outside world. I should say no necessary relation. It's simply a technique that takes place within the narrative. Another trope is alternative reports, where you will have a case where a story conflicts with an alternative report, and the implied reader is given knowledge of what actually happened, while also being inoculated against other versions of the story, other kinds of explanations, which may cause doubt about what actually happened in the narrative. Another technique is causative links, that is, when you say this caused this. Even though you're talking about mythic and non-real events, you can still fit them into a network in which real political events are connected with your own imagined events in a kind of cause and effect relationship. And finally, you can talk about present traces of the past. In this case, I use the example of tomb tokens. A narrator can say that Jesus rose from the dead, and there still survive tokens or signs, material artifacts that verify that resurrection, such as Jesus's headcloth or maybe the entire wrappings around his body, that these exist today and they verify the story of the resurrection. And this story of the resurrection may be true, or it may be a product out of the writer's head. Another feature of the introduction is that I try to redefine the genre of the Gospels as mythic historiography. And I base this term on terms that I saw when reading Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Diodorus of Sicily, when they explicitly said that they were trying to make the myths, or put the myths, in historiographical form. Generally, mythic historiography is a genre in which an ancient author rationalizes myths, such as the Heracles saga, to bring them into Historia, to present them as real events in the past. And my argument is that the Gospel writers used the same genre and techniques for more recent mythoi about Jesus. And the objection here is that ancient writers put ancient myths into historiographical form, whereas Gospel writers put recent myths into historiographical form. The fact remains that a mythos can be generated in recent times. There's nothing that prohibits the generation of new mythoi. And there is also nothing which prohibits the speedy historicization of new mythoi either. As I like to say, no one is above myth. We all believe certain myths or mythoi that make up who we are. And those who are emotionally involved in their mythology, and we all to some extent are, We'll do what it takes to make it seem true both to ourselves and to others. For those in Western cultures, what is true is often what is taken to be historical. So there is a motivation today, as well as way back in the late 1st and early 2nd century, to historicize one's myths in order to purify them of the fantastical and make them seem true to outside audiences. And this is exactly the language that someone like Plutarch will use, that he purifies the myths, such as the myth of Theseus fighting the Minotaur, or the myth of Isis and Osiris. He weeds out all the fantastical and unbelievable elements by a process of rationalization in order to give the myth more of a historical appearance, so that it can be believed and we can gain more lessons from the myth. So that, my friend, is my introduction to the book, How the Gospels Became History, Jesus and Mediterranean Myths. I put up the full bibliographical entry here in hopes that you will go check it out, and on the basis of this video, decide whether you want to purchase it and journey with me through each of the chapters that are forthcoming in this series. For now, I want to thank everybody and encourage you all to check out my notes, which in this book are endnotes, and my suggestions for further reading in the book, in hopes that you will take this further and learn more in your own quest for truth and learning. Thanks for joining me.